She abandoned him. My brother's lawyer said it like it was fact, like it was already decided. Our client was the one who showed up. Our client was the one who called. The respondent was nowhere to be found for the last 3 years of his life, and now she wants to collect. My brother sat at the table across from me in a sport coat he'd bought for the occasion. I could tell because the tag crease was still in the sleeve. He had flown in from Calgary 2 days ago. He hadn't visited our father in 4 years, but he showed up for this. The notary looked at me over her reading glasses. Ms. Beaumont Clary, do you wish to respond? I didn't stand. I folded my hands on the table and said, not yet. I'm waiting for someone. My brother's lawyer made a noise. My sister-in-law, who had positioned herself 2 seats away like she was already interior decorating the cottage in her head, shifted in her chair. 30 seconds later, the door opened. She was a small woman in a navy blazer that had seen better days. She carried a canvas tote bag from a library book sale and wore no jewelry except a watch with a cracked face. She introduced herself to the notary as the estate trustee from TD Canada Trust, acting on behalf of my father's estate. She placed a sealed envelope on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times and felt nothing about it. The air in the room changed. My brother looked at me. I looked at my hands. I had driven my father to that bank 3 years ago. I had sat in the waiting area reading an old Maclean's while he signed the papers. I knew exactly what was in that envelope. My father's name was Bernard. Bernie, to everyone who actually knew him. He had been a high school shop teacher in Sudbury for 31 years. He smelled like sawdust and Old Spice and made the best tourtière in the family, and he died in February with snow on the ground and a hospital blanket tucked under his chin and my hand in his. My brother Félix was not there for that. He sent flowers. The estate was not enormous by any objective measure, but it was real. The cottage on Lake Nipissing, the house in the Donovan that he'd paid off in 2019, a modest RRSP that he'd never touched, a GIC, some savings bonds from the 90s he'd forgotten about, until I found them in a shoebox during a cleanup. Altogether, the notary had assessed the estate at somewhere around $700,000. Not life-changing, life-altering, maybe. Enough to matter. Félix wanted it. All of it, if possible, or at minimum, the cottage. He'd been calling it the family property since before my father died. He started saying it at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, the family property, like the possessive had already transferred, like the decision was already made and we were all just waiting for the paperwork. When I didn't agree, when I pointed out that Papa had said more than once, to more than one person, that he wanted things divided fairly and that fairness meant accounting for the past. Félix called me something I won't repeat. He said it in front of his wife and their kids, at our father's kitchen table, with my father in the next room in a hospital bed. He said I was only there for the money, that I'd engineered the whole situation, that I'd isolated Papa from the family. That was 9 months before the meeting in the notary's office, before the woman with the cracked watch sat down across from my brother's lawyer and folded her hands and waited. I need to tell you about my father's diagnosis, because without it, none of this makes sense. He was diagnosed with COPD in his early 60s. Manageable at first. He kept teaching. He kept making tourtière. He drove himself to appointments and shoveled his own driveway and called me every Sunday at 7 o'clock whether I wanted to talk or not. That was Papa. Stubborn and consistent and always punctual. By the time he retired, the disease had progressed. He went from 1 inhaler to 2. Then to an oxygen concentrator at night. Then to an oxygen concentrator at night. Then to home oxygen full-time. He needed help. Real help. Not the kind that means you call on Christmas and ask if he needs anything and then go back to your life in Calgary. The kind that means you show up. I was the one who showed up. I want to say that plainly. Not for sympathy, but because it matters for what comes later. I was living in North Bay at the time, 40 minutes from Sudbury. I had a remote job in project coordination and a small apartment and a cat named something embarrassing that I won't mention here. I restructured my entire schedule around his appointments. Every pulmonologist visit, every respiratory therapy session, every CT scan and flu shot and pharmacy pickup. I kept a shared Google Calendar with his care schedule. I learned how to manage his medications. I learned the early warning signs of a COPD exacerbation. I learned when he needed to slow down and when he was just being dramatic about a hill. I did this for 2.5 years. Félix called occasionally. Less than occasionally, toward the end, my sister-in-law sent a fruit basket at Easter with a card that said, "Thinking of you." My father kept it on the kitchen counter until it shriveled. He didn't say anything about it. He was too polite for that. But he wrote things down. That was the thing about my father. He kept a journal. He'd done it since his 20s. Cheap spiral notebooks from Dollarama, one a year. He kept them in a plastic bin in the bedroom closet. I had no idea what was in them. I never looked. It wasn't my business, and he was a private man, and I respected that. I found out what was in them the day the woman with the cracked watch opened her canvas tote. The notary read the trust document out loud. My brother's lawyer was quiet for the first time since the meeting had started. Félix's jaw was doing something complicated. The estate had been placed into a trust 6 months before my father died. Not unusual, the notary explained. Wills in Ontario go through probate, which can take time and cost money. A trust bypasses probate entirely. It also, in this case, included a provision my brother's lawyer clearly had not anticipated. She read the clause. It was standard language, dry and airless, but the meaning was not. Any beneficiary who launched a legal challenge to the trust, or who disputed the cognitive capacity of the grantor, would forfeit their interest in the estate entirely. Not reduced. Gone. My brother had filed a notice of objection with the estate trustee 6 weeks before this meeting. His lawyer had sent a letter questioning my father's capacity at the time of signing, citing age and medication history. He had, without knowing it, already lost. I watched his wife do the math. I watched her realize what her husband had done by listening to her when she pushed for the aggressive approach. She looked at the fruit basket. I am not being metaphorical. She literally looked at the window, which is where I imagine the fruit basket lives in her head. Félix pointed at me. You knew about this. I drove him to the bank, I said. You set this up. He set it up. I drove him. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Félix shook it off. She was isolating him. Our whole family was kept away from him for the last years of his life. She controlled his access to us. The notary's expression didn't change. The woman from TD Trust looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at the table. The notary asked the estate trustee to respond to the allegations. The woman with the cracked watch reached into her canvas tote and put 2 things on the table. The first was a bundle of journals, 5 of them, spiral-bound in a rubber band. The second was a printout, long and dense, that she described as the detailed records from my father's personal Bell account. Every call, every text, every voicemail flag cross-referenced with entries from the journals. The grantor, she said, was a careful man. I had not read those journals. I want to be clear about that. I did not know what was in them until that moment in the notary's office, when the trustee opened the topmost one to a page, marked with a sticky note, and read from my father's handwriting in a voice completely free of emotion. The entry was from Father's Day, 2 years before he died. Félix had promised to drive down from Calgary. He had a conference, he'd said later, an apology delivered by text with a sad face emoji. My father's entry for that day was 4 lines. He wrote that he had made a chicken for dinner instead of going to the trouble of a roast, since it would just be himself and me. He wrote that he had hoped Félix might surprise him. He wrote that the chicken was good. And he wrote that Cécile had stopped by. Cécile is the neighbor. And they'd had coffee on the porch, and that had been a nice thing. 4 lines. No bitterness. Just the facts. The bell records for that date showed one outgoing call from my father's number to Felix's number. Duration 22 seconds. No incoming calls from Felix that day. The trustee turned to another marked page. My brother's birthday. An outgoing call. Voicemail. No return call for 11 days. Another page. October, Thanksgiving weekend. My father had written, called Félix to confirm Sunday. He said Audrey has her family coming and it would be too much. That's all right. Maëlle is here, and she made the tourtière. It was very good. Nearly as good as mine. He could not help himself, even then. Even in a private journal. He had to be fair. He wrote, nearly. My brother's face, by this point, had gone a particular color I associate with a bad hand in cards. The bell records confirmed every entry. Outgoing calls, short durations, weeks between contact. And on our side of the ledger, my number, my father's calendar, his pharmacy records, his appointment history, contact so frequent it read like a full-time job. Which it was. The respondent did not isolate the grantor, the trustee said. The grantor documented his own isolation. He simply chose not to burden anyone with it. That last sentence hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. I had to look at the table for a moment. The room was very quiet. Then Félix tried something else. He straightened in his chair and said that our father had been on significant medications toward the end, palliative-level care. That his cognition had been impaired, that a man in that condition couldn't reasonably be expected to understand what he was signing. His lawyer nodded, finding footing again. He said the trust had been signed while the grantor was on hydromorphine for pain management and that this constituted grounds to challenge capacity. The notary looked at the trustee. The trustee looked at me. I had been waiting for this. I had been waiting for exactly this since the moment I realized, 2 years before my father died, that Félix was the kind of person who would say these things, who would reduce his father to a diagnosis when it was convenient and ignore that same father when it wasn't. I said he knew this was coming. He prepared for it. The trustee opened the tote bag again. She placed a document on the table. Then a second document. Both were from a geriatric psychiatrist and a capacity assessor, both provincially certified. Both commissioned 6 weeks before my father signed the trust amendment. Both concluded that Bernard Beaumont Clary was fully capable of understanding his financial affairs, his family relationships, and the legal implications of the documents he was signing. There was also a video. 40 minutes of it, recorded by the capacity assessor. In it, my father sits at his kitchen table in the blue cardigan he wore every winter, and he explains, in his own words, in his clear and unhurried Sudburian French English, exactly why he is restructuring the estate the way he is. He names his children. He describes his reasoning. He talks about what he values. At one point, he makes a joke about the price of firewood. At no point does he appear confused. The trustee also placed 2 cancelled checks on the table, both drawn from my father's account, both marked capacity assessment in the memo line. My father had paid for his own cognitive evaluation. He had known, with the clarity of a man who had watched his children carefully for 6 decades, that it would come to this. He had paid for his own defense in advance. He was on pain medication, Félix said. His voice different now. Smaller. He was lucid, I said. I was there. You were always there. He said it like an accusation. Yes, I said. I was. There was a memory underneath all of it that I hadn't let myself think about for a long time, but it surfaced in that room, in the silence after Félix ran out of arguments, and I couldn't push it back down. I was 23. I had just started my first real job. I was barely making rent in a basement apartment in Sudbury, and I was proud of it, proud in the way that only people who weren't supposed to make it can be proud. My father called me on a Tuesday night. The tone of his voice told me before the words did. He said he and my mother, they were still together then, barely, had made some financial decisions that hadn't worked out. He said they had used a line of credit against the house to invest in a business opportunity that had not been legitimate. He said the words significant debt and possible insolvency in the same sentence in that quiet, careful way he had, the way that meant he was ashamed and doing his best not to collapse under it. Félix had co-signed the line of credit. He was 26. He walked away. He moved to Alberta, changed banks, let my father manage the fallout alone. My father never blamed him, not once, out loud. But he managed that debt for 6 years. He refinanced. He took on extra work. He did summer school. He ate simply and he didn't travel, and he quietly rebuilt, alone, without complaint, in that way of his that looked like stoicism but was really just a kind of loneliness he'd learned to live with. And I watched it. I watched it for 6 years from 40 minutes away, while my brother built a life in Calgary that he occasionally described as doing well for himself. So when Félix sat across from me in that notary's office and said I had engineered everything, that I had isolated our father, that I was only there for the money, I thought about that phone call. I thought about what my father's voice sounded like when he was $20,000 into a problem he hadn't created. I thought about who showed up. I showed up, not for the money. Because he was my father and he was alone and someone had to. The notary dismissed the objection. The trust was confirmed valid. The notice of objection that Félix had filed 6 weeks earlier, the one his lawyer had submitted without fully understanding the document it was challenging, had triggered the no contest clause. As of the moment that letter was filed, Félix had forfeited his share. He sat very still when she said that. His wife stood up first. She said something under her breath to the lawyer. The lawyer gathered his papers with the energy of a man billing by the hour who was very glad this particular hour was ending. Félix looked at me. His face was not angry anymore. It was something worse. It was the face of a man realizing he had done this to himself and that there was no one in the room who was going to help him undo it. "You should have told me," he said. "I told you to wait. I told you to talk to me before doing anything legal. You told me I could go to hell." He opened his mouth. He closed it. "Félix," I said, and I kept my voice even because I was not going to let this room see me cry. I spent 2.5 years managing his medications, driving him to appointments, sleeping on his pull-out couch when he had bad nights. I was there when he was scared. I was there when he needed someone to hold his hand and pretend that dying wasn't happening as fast as it was. You sent flowers. That's not isolation. That's a choice you made. And it has consequences, and I'm sorry, but those consequences are not mine to fix. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't used to not having an answer. I picked up my bag. Outside, the March air was still cold, the way Sudbury stays cold past the point of reason, that stubborn northern cold that doesn't care what the calendar says. My breath made small clouds. I stood by my car for a moment before unlocking it. My brother followed me out. He said the cottage had been in the family for 3 generations, that his kids had been going there their whole lives, that it wasn't right. I said, "Your kids have been there twice in 4 years. My father told me." He wrote it down. He said he had a mortgage. He said things were tight. He said family was supposed to help each other. I looked at him. I thought about my father's voice on a Tuesday night. I thought about a line of credit and a flight to Calgary. "You're right," I said. Family is supposed to help each other. I got in the car. He stood in the parking lot in his sport coat with the crease still in the sleeve, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror when I drove away. 6 weeks later, the estate was settled. The cottage transferred into my name. The house was listed as my father had directed, with the proceeds going into a managed account designated for specific uses he'd outlined in the trust. The GIC and savings bonds covered legal fees and the cost of the capacity assessments, which my father had, with what I can only describe as precise, premeditated foresight, itemized in advance. The trustee called to confirm the final transfer. She had the same dry, even voice on the phone as she'd had in the office. She said everything was in order. She said my father's records had made the process unusually clean. She said, in the tone of someone making a neutral professional observation, That in her 20 years handling estates she had never seen documentation that thorough. I said, he was a shop teacher. He believed in measuring twice. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. My brother's lawyer sent a letter 3 weeks after that exploring the possibility of a mediated settlement. I passed it to my own lawyer, who responded appropriately. I did not respond personally. There was nothing to say that the journals and the bell records and 40 minutes of video hadn't already said better than I could. I drove up to the cottage in late May, the first weekend after the ice went out, because that was when my father always opened it. The birch trees were just coming in. The dock had heaved over the winter and needed resetting. There was a coffee can of screws in the shed, and a level and a rubber mallet, and every tool in there was labeled in my father's handwriting. I sat on the dock while the sun went down over the lake, and I didn't make any promises about healing or moving on or any of the other things people say when they think resolution is supposed to feel like something. It felt like quiet. It felt like mine. I had not blocked my brother. I hadn't decided not to. It just hadn't seemed necessary because I had already done the only thing that mattered. I had stopped waiting for him to show up. The dock needed one more plank replaced on the far end. I found the right piece of wood in the shed, in the stack my father had left there, like he knew. I carried it down to the water, and I got to work. My father kept a coffee can of screws in the shed, labeled in his own handwriting. That detail stays with me more than almost anything else from those 2.5 years. He labeled everything. He measured everything. He believed in the quiet, practical way of a man who taught teenagers how to build things that last. That careful preparation was its own form of respect. For the work, for the people who come after, for the truth of what a thing actually is. I think about that a lot now, about what it means to actually do the right thing when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. I didn't care for my father because I expected something in return. I did it because he needed someone and I was able to be that someone, and walking away from that would have been a kind of lie I couldn't live with. That's not virtue in any grand sense. It's just the ordinary, unglamorous decision to show up. Again and again, in the cold, in the middle of the night, on days when I was tired and it wasn't convenient, and I did it anyway because he was my dad and he mattered. What I didn't fully understand until the notary's office was that my father had been watching all of it, not judging. Just watching, the way he always had, with that careful, patient attention he gave to everything he loved. He wrote it down. Every missed call, every broken promise, every Sunday I drove up and every Sunday Félix didn't. He wasn't keeping score either. He was just being honest. In the private pages of a Dollarama notebook, the same way he was honest about everything. The chicken was good, nearly as good as mine. That was the man. Precise and fair and never cruel, even about people who deserved it. There's something I've had to sit with since all of this ended. My brother isn't stupid. He knew what he was doing when he filed that objection. He had chosen over and over for years to prioritize his own comfort, and when the consequences arrived, he tried to use the legal system to make that someone else's problem. What stopped him wasn't luck. It was preparation, my father's and mine. My father had the wisdom to see what was coming and the discipline to spend months building a defense that I didn't even know existed, and I had enough sense, when it mattered, to stay quiet and let that preparation do its work instead of panicking. I think that's the thing, actually. The trap didn't work because I was clever. It worked because we were both patient. My father understood that integrity compounds over time the same way debt does. Every entry in that journal, every appointment I drove him to, every night I slept on his pull-out couch. None of it was strategic, but all of it was real. And real things leave records, and records don't lie the way people do. Félix stood in that parking lot in a sport coat that still had the crease from the hanger and asked me to fix what he had broken. I couldn't, not because I didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to fix. Some things don't survive the choices we make about them. That's not a punishment. It's just how cause and effect works, quiet and indifferent as the ice going out on Lake Nipissing in May. I replaced the plank on the far end of the dock, My father had left exactly the right piece of wood in the shed. I don't think that was an accident.